to the Woolrack Zoom forum, and Kevin's may have used the term DVO at Bunbury. Is that the correct term still these days, Kevin?
Might as well use that. We call ourselves FVO nowadays, Field Vet Officer.
During our work-up for this forum, the McClartys raised the issue of ARGT becoming a concern for the West Coastal Plain, and that prompted us to bring Kevin in to talk about the subject and to provide some insight as to how we might manage it.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. First of all, annual ryegrass toxicity, ARGT, is not a new disease. It's been in Western Australia for yonks, but there is this perception that it's been fairly new on the West Coastal Plain. I came to Bunbury about 5 years ago, and I think a year or two after that started to see a couple of cases around Mundachong, and I think every year since then I've seen half a dozen cases where I've done autopsies of, but aware of others that other vets have done, and then other phone calls from other producers. So it is here. But bear in mind that the organism that causes ARGT is present statewide. Testing of export hay shows that basically anywhere in the southwestern of Western Australia that organism is present, and therefore the potential could be there for toxicity. So just to review what ARGT is, ARGT occurs when annual ryegrass, principally Wimmera rye, but sometimes other grasses, becomes infested with a particular soil nematode. We can also carry the organism bacteria into the ryegrass, and the nematode causes a gall to be produced instead of a seed, and then the bacteria infects this gall and produces a toxin, a Corynetoxin toxin. So if the bacteria is present in the soil, the nematode can carry it into the ryegrass. So if I just talk about this season in pasture or hay that was produced from the spring of last year, there's about half a dozen cases that I've been involved with, and I just sort of mentioned the sort of toxicity numbers so you can get a feel from it. In February, I went to Mundachong, and there was a property that had 200 yearling steers, and they were feeding hay that was harvested from a nearby property. In the end, 46 of those 200 died. So fairly spectacular mortality rate and very costly for the producer. A couple of weeks ago, I had a call from a vet who'd been in Mardella, and 4 out of 60 had died with clinical signs. It was in the middle of summer somewhere. I know it's stinking hot. I went to Ravenswood for another property, and there were not that many cattle on the property, probably about 40, but one particular paddock had 6 bulls, and 3 of those had clinical signs, were autopsied and confirmed ARGT. Another property in Pinjarra had 20 deaths out of 200 animals. So disease is here. There's not maybe spectacular numbers of particular farms, but I mean, those indicate to me there's a lot of other farms that would have it, that have the occasional death or be getting subclinical signs. And just to illustrate how ARGT is not just a wheat belt disease, 2 weeks ago at Burracup, there was a case of 18 dairy animals, steers, in a paddock. 14 of those died at the time. The other 4 were affected. There's a good chance that some, or at least most of those, would have died. There was another case in Capel again in February. And this afternoon I'm going to a property in near Boyanup, which sounds like it could well be ARGT. So it is a disease that can occur in this area. So the symptoms, first of all, to bear in mind that ARGT is a cumulative toxin. You don't get deaths and clinical signs as soon as you introduce them to toxic pasture or toxic hay. It takes a number of weeks before they can ingest enough of the poison for it to build up into the system to cause the clinical signs that you might see. But during this time, and maybe even the years before you've got this sign, there's likely to be production loss, like reduced weight gain, reduced fertility, and abortions. Some cases that you will get abortions there. Now, the main symptom that gets reported to me, similar to this Boyanup case, is that a farmer's found a couple of animals found dead. There were a couple of the day before, and another this morning, and then you usually get the call. And just about always, this is attributed to something else, snake bite, for example. But if signs are seen, and sometimes they're not seen until the animals are stressed or moved around the paddock, the animals tend to fall to the back. The signs are neurological. The animals fall to the back of the mob. They can have an abnormal gait. Head sort of sways a bit from side to side. They might rock back and forth on the one spot. They lose the balance, or they're walking along and they just fall. When they're down, they are paddling. They've got tremors, they're shaking, convulsions, salivation. And it's about that stage that you would wanting to go get the rifle to put them down, because it's a terrible welfare situation to see them in that sort of situation. They often have their neck extended, the limbs extended, and they are stiff. So a few other points, just looking at the time. I mentioned that toxin is cumulative. It's also likely that it would take years from whence the organism gets onto a property before it reaches levels that are toxic enough to cause a risk to livestock. So, and during that time, there's likely to be these production effects in reduced fertility and reduced weight gain and what have you. Dan, a bit later, is going to talk on some of the risks in pasture thing, and I see Danny Roberts has been online as well. He's a real expert in this disease as well, may have some comments. But typically you'll see it here in paddocks that are closed up for hay or crop production and alternate years. For myself, I found it uncommon to see clinical signs of poisoning in paddocks that have been grazed throughout the year, for every year, even though neighbours may have signs. And I've not seen it on properties or in paddocks that have definitely have improved pasture that has definitely established. So uncommon for me to have seen it on dairy farms, but to see it on other properties. But I'll leave Dan to talk about with his talk later. But I should just bear in mind that ARGT is not the only neurological disease that you can see in the Peel region. There's two other cases which I thought were going to be ARGT that turned out not to be. One 2 or 3 months ago, I didn't do this case, but I approved a subsidised disease investigation for it, neurological cases in the Murray Shire where they've been feeding out hay. I said, yep, that'll be definitely ARGT. It turned out to be Histophilus. Now, Histophilus is an organism that affects the brain and the lungs, respiratory tract. It's associated with bovine respiratory disease, but the neurological signs can look much the same. So often, what you think is going to be the diagnosis is not. And another case that I went to that turned out to be Tyleria, we had 2 steers left in the paddock. They were walking funny. I thought it might have been ARGT. So I chased one of these around as it started to slow up, and then it came to still like one of those animals you saw. Then it fell down and it promptly died right there and then. And that turned out to be Tyleria, which is another disease that might be seen on irrigated pasture over summer. Look, I've just gone my 10 minutes, but I'll just mention just 1 or 2 other diseases that we're seeing here while we're there. Seeing lots of cases of Salmonella in Western Australia, including cases here, seeing it anywhere from calves 5 to 6 days old right through to adult animals, often with diarrhoea or often just sort of found dead sort of cases as well. And I like to sort of just recommend to the producers listening that, the department does subsidise the laboratory investigation of diseases, either subsidising with a private vet for their fees, but also the lab fees. And of course, if it's done by myself or other government field vets, all of the investigation is free, and that's mainly associated with proving our market, our freedom of disease for market access. So just in summary, ARGT is present in your region, and I think you'd be wise to consider how you might manage pasture in the future to avoid both the subclinical effects and the possibility of death later on. Thank you.
Any more details on that Salmonella, Kevin, what the more symptoms are and what it looks like in young cattle and age groups, etc.?
Well, Salmonella has occurred in every animal in the last couple of months, from crocodiles to birds to sheep to cattle. And sometimes it's just been found dead, calves with often very little signs. Sometimes there's been diarrhoea, fairly acute diarrhoea with blood before death. But there's been lots of cases of it, yeah. So often acute death without clinical signs or otherwise a diarrhea syndrome.
So the salmonella in calves is virtually the scours that we see in the young calves. And do you have a suggestion of the best treatment for the scours in those calves?
Well, there are lots of other causes of diarrhea in calves as well. I mean, it's one of the advantages of getting a confirmed diagnosis is to find out the bug involved and also to find out the most effective antibiotic for treating it. Rehydration therapy is good. Antibiotics also is the case if it's got early enough. But early identification and separation of animals from the rest of the herd or rest of the groups a good strategy as well.
Is it something that can come through on the calves from a few days old, or generally a bit older than that? When they should be in theory protected by colostrum, or?
Look, most of the cases tend to occur a little bit after a couple of days old. 7 days, 8, 9 days are the cases that I've been seeing lately, right through to adult level. But young animals, or maybe it's when they just first got their colostrum in the first couple of days, we're not getting cases of it, or maybe some of those cases have just been attributed to a difficult birth and other factors. Just one question. I know one of the properties here had it. They burnt all their property. Is that the best way to eradicate it? That is a question that's probably better answered by Dan or Danny Roberts.
In terms of management of annual ryegrass toxicity, we've got Dan Parnell online today. He is an agronomist who happens to work with the McClartys at Blythewood, and Dan's going to talk about ARGT and its management. Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I might just throw to Danny. Did you have any comment around that burning of the grass in the paddocks that was mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I put it on chat, but basically you need a hot burn to kill ryegrass seed on the ground, and therefore burning in summertime is preferable to get a hot burn than, say, burning in autumn time. The burn just goes over top of the ground. It doesn't destroy as much seed.
Yeah, so we're just looking at destroying the ryegrass seed bank rather than destroying the organism itself. Is that what you're saying?
Well, in destroying the ryegrass seed bank, by burning, you also destroy the organism.
Yep. Okay, and so hopefully that clears that one up for us. I had a chat to Kevin last week, and to be honest, I haven't come across a lot of ARGT in my travels, and I think that's probably because the people I talk to improve their pastures a fair bit and have a slightly different feed base. And when I asked Kevin, what do the farms look like, and I could imagine in some of those areas that there would be a big part of the feed base there would be Wimmera ryegrass or the rigidum variety. That's a very short variety. I was envisioning that there's probably the subclover might have been a big part of the percentage of the feed that's available there. So and probably understocked, which a lot of some of those properties in the northern areas can be at times, particularly over summer, where there's a big, heavy burden of ryegrass that's got away in spring and produced a lot of seed head. And at the same time, I was imagining the scenario where hay has been cut quite late, which is often another practice that happens up perhaps in the northern regions of the southwest, that a lot of that would contain the Wimmera ryegrass that would be infected. So to have a double whammy of the dry feed having a lot of the toxin in the feed itself, and then feeding some mature hay back out at the same time would increase the risk. So that was just the conversation Kevin and I had last week, and ways around dealing with that are probably simply improve. And probably another scenario that might play is that people, it's all purely ryegrass, let's put a heap of nitrogen on it and spring and grow more of it. So we have more of this toxic ryegrass as a percentage of the feed available. So I can imagine some of those scenarios have snowballed and become a real issue. So from a farm management point of view, it's probably just a numbers game and reducing that amount of Lollium rigidum of that seed head in the ration. And there's heaps of ways of doing that, but the obvious way is improving your pasture and moving to a longer season varieties like the multiflorum varieties, which is an improved pasture. Whether it be some cheap tortilla or whatever is going around, I think it's a better fit agronomically for this environment, but also reduce the risk of toxicity, ryegrass tox, and or just improving your legume base. If there's something that legumes fade out of the pastures a little bit for whatever reason, managing to get that back in your system as well will help reduce your risk. And also maybe if you've got a bad paddock that that's got some infection, and perhaps spraying it out and putting new varieties in, or a crop of oats or something to try and reduce the burden on farm, and where you've got an option to put cattle or sheep, in a high risk environment. So just to me, that was the systems approach that I was thinking. I was just confirmed what I was thinking, what those farms and pastures look like with Kevin last week, and just some real simple agronomic things to look at and to try and reduce the risk, reduce the numbers. And I think to me, it sounds like a numbers game because of that cumulative effect of the toxin. We can reduce that numbers game and just vary the ration a little bit away from just ryegrass seed head. I think that will reduce the risk. And I'm sort of more interested in also in the subclinical issues around, there's some real disasters there that Kevin talked about, but also interested in some of the things affecting fertility and just the subclinical signs in some of the herds around as well. So that's probably all I had to comment on. I don't know if everyone else has got some added comments around that.
Dan, I like that you were painting in my mind about management. My comment is this, with a question. In the higher rainfall areas to the east of the Darling Scarp, there's very little ARGT on sheep properties. There is some, but it's reasonable. It's rare, I would say, until you go east of the Great Southern Highway, where it starts to become more common out in the wheat belt. What I'd like to know is what is the characteristic of the production system in those high rainfall areas that makes it not suitable for ARGT to occur, and could some of those production system features be transferable to the West Coast?
Yeah, I've had some experience in that Darkin area, Tim, and you know how hard they run the sheep there. And there's not a blade of grass sitting around there at this time of year. So they do, like Kevin mentioned earlier, they don't let the ryegrass get away at all, hardly at all. So, and a strong subclover base. So I think that might play a part in a pretty heavy lupin ration. You know, when the whip's cracking sort of in the summer or autumn. So I think that's part of that puzzle, perhaps, is their system there. They really graze those pastures hard, where probably the scenarios that Kevin was talking about, not heavily stocked, the grass has gone mad in spring, real fire hazard, majority of it's Wimmera ryegrass. Yeah, to me, asking for trouble. I know on our farm at Tambler back in the day, we used to get it too. And I'd argue, yeah, we were understocked and things got out of hand for us and didn't feed much, you know. So that's probably the systems thing I would comment on. Whether there's an environmental factor on top of that, possibly, I don't know. But from a farming system point of view, that's the big difference, I would think.
Most of the cases that I've been involved on the West Coast have been where people have, as Kevin said, the organism's been introduced many, many, many years ago, and it's at a low level on the farm. And while they manage the farm where there is no cropping, ARGT doesn't have a chance to build up, the organism doesn't have a chance to build it up. These farms that, these small farms that I've seen where ARGT occurred, quite often they've selected a paddock and they continuously crop that paddock for hay production. In the process, they go from a long season variety of ryegrass to a short season variety of ryegrass in that paddock. That short season ryegrass is much more in sync with the nematode to build its numbers up, and as the numbers build up, it builds the bacterial numbers up as well. And so, like Dan was saying, that one of the control mechanisms is to get back to a long season ryegrass on your property. it does get invaded by the nematode, but the cues for to invade the seed head are mixed up. So therefore, there's not much invasion compared to ryegrass. There's not much invasion. There's not much invasion of the seed head by the nematode. And there's a whole series of trials many years ago where it shows some really good control just using long season variety ryegrass in wheat belt areas. So it's setting why it's occurring sporadically on the farm on the west coast is one, the sporadic paddocks infected across the coast, the sand plain there. But those paddocks that most at risk is when you've been cropping it for 5, 6, 7 years and you're building up the ryegrass population. You're also building up the nematode population within that ryegrass, and eventually leads to ARGT.
Well, that's a nice picture that you painted there. Just a couple of comments on the chat. Haley says twist fungus is no longer being produced, which is a very good control mechanism, which is most unfortunate, but no longer available as a tool. I can tell you that I personally went off up to the wheat belt to a twist fungus infected property and collected twist and introduced it to my farm, and that seems to be working, albeit that it's at a very low level at this time. And then a question from Gordon, is all certified ryegrass seed clean of the nematode dam?
I believe so, yes. I think that's part of the merchants, that the ticket to sell. I'm 100% certain that that's the case, yeah.
And Owen says, is there a particular soil type where ARGT is more prevalent?
Ryegrass is like clay-based soils, and so you get higher density of ryegrass on those soils, and particularly if it's waterlogged, it suits the transmission of the nematode. So yeah, heavy soils, and the other point about the seed, certified seed, yes, is checked for annual ryegrass, but a lot of seed is sold straight off the harvester and that sort of stuff, and that's never been checked. That's one of the reasons why ARGT has been spread around.